Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something really fascinating, but also pretty sobering. We're going to take an analytical journey into the anatomy of annihilation. Basically, we want to figure out how the sheer scale of warfare evolved from the primal devastation of the 13th century steppes, all the way to the Battle of Kursk, which is literally the single largest battle in the history of warfare. It's an incredible story of logistics, staggering numbers, and ultimately, the real humans caught in the crossfire.
All right, let's just dive right into our roadmap for today. First, we'll define the scale of war, then look at the primal blueprint of the Mongols, jump forward to the ultimate clash at Kursk, explore the psychological reality on the ground, and wrap up with the true cost of victory.
Okay, part 1. Defining the scale of war and measuring the immeasurable. You know, when historians look back at massive clashes like Borodino, Leipzig, or Stalingrad, there's this huge temptation to just rank them by body count or the number of tanks. But as this quote points out, doing that kind of misses the point. Using such a blunt metric ignores the fact that the intensity of action is not so easily measured. Think about it. A localized fight might only involve a few dozen people, but the sheer brutality for those guys could be off the charts. We really can't fall into the trap of treating individual soldiers as just data points on a spreadsheet, even when we're talking about millions of them.
And hey, speaking of millions, look at this staggering number to set our historical baseline, 40 million. That is the estimated death toll of the Mongol Empire's conquests. Under Genghis Khan, warfare wasn't just about capturing some territory. It was about erasing entire civilizations. Places like Nishapur 1221 turned into a graveyard in a matter of days. It's the brutal truth of warfare at its absolute most primal, and it establishes a pretty terrifying baseline for what we now call total war.
Moving on to Section 2, the Primal War Blueprint. Let's look at the anatomy of the horde. To really get this, we have to look at Genghis Khan. Born into slavery and starvation on the frozen steppes, he somehow built the most brutal military machine the world had ever seen. How? Well, the Mongol decimal system. He totally shattered old tribal loyalties. Every warrior was put into a 10-man squad called an arban. 10 of those made a jagun of 100. Then a Minghan of 1,000, all the way up to a Tuman, 10,000 horsemen. It was this living, breathing, organically cohesive unit where guys lived, fought, and died together. Fast forward 700 years to World War II, and we see those organic bonds replaced by the massive, rigid, mechanized bureaucracy of multi-army fronts. The efficiency of this primal setup was just unreal. The whole army functioned like one giant organism. Their horses were actually pretty small, only 12 to 14 hands high, but man, their endurance was insane. They could survive freezing temperatures and forage for themselves, which completely eliminated the need for those slow, massive supply trains. And because each guy rode with 3 to 5 horses, they could just swap them out and cover a mind-blowing 200 kilometers in 3 days. This whole shebang was glued together by the Yasa Code, basically absolute discipline. Retreating meant death, not just for you, but for your entire 10-man arban. Add in their mastery of the composite bow, and yeah, they were practically unstoppable.
Which brings us to Section 3, Kursk, the ultimate clash, the absolute apex of industrial combat. Exactly 7 centuries later, by the summer of 1943, that primal idea of rapid, sweeping warfare had mutated into something entirely different. Something heavily industrialized, anchored by steel, oil, and massive supply chains. At Kursk, total war hit its absolute peak. We are talking about the single largest battle in the history of warfare. Just look at these numbers. The Germans massed about 777,000 soldiers. Opposing them, the Soviet Red Army piled in a staggering 1.9 million soldiers across their defensive fronts and reserves. This one single operation sucked in over 70% of Germany's entire armored force on the Eastern Front. It is just mind-boggling.
But you might be wondering, how on earth did so many troops end up crammed into this one specific spot? Well, it all boils down to a massive, fatal delay. Back in April 1943, Hitler issued Operational Order No. 6. The goal was to pinch off the Kursk salient, basically a huge, vulnerable bulge in the Soviet line. But he decided to wait. He wanted his shiny new toys on the battlefield, specifically the brand new Panther tanks and more of the Tiger heavy tanks. So he delayed it through May and then through June. And that delay, it gave the Red Army the one thing they desperately needed: time. So what did the Soviets do with that borrowed time? Well, they actually knew the German plans months in advance, thanks to intelligence networks like the Lucy spy ring. So they engineered a defense literally designed to grind those armored spearheads into dust. This is wild. Look at this density. 2,400 anti-tank mines and 2,700 anti-personnel mines planted for every single mile of front. That is an insane amount of explosives. They built multiple deep defensive belts and secretly hid a colossal reserve force, known as the Steppe Front, right behind the battle area. To wrap our heads around the sheer chaos here, we need to know the actual military operations at play. The initial German attack to cut off that bulge started on July 5th. That was codenamed Operation Citadel. But the fighting didn't just stop when Citadel stalled out. Nope, it immediately flipped into these massive Soviet counteroffensives. You had Operation Kutuzov pushing north and Operation Polkovodets-Rumyantsev pushing south. It was a relentless meat grinder. All right, Section 4, Steel, Mud, and Psychology. The anatomy of the soldier. We've been looking at the macro view, right? Millions of men, grand strategies, massive armies. But let's bring this right down into the mud and the trenches. I really want you to think about this question. What actually happens to the human mind when the two largest war machines in history just smash into each other? Imagine thousands of tanks firing at once, and artillery barrages dropping more shells in 50 minutes than in entire previous campaigns. What does that do to a person? The historical accounts give us a pretty harrowing answer. We have eyewitness records like this one captured by Vasily Grossman, describing guys who were quite literally losing their ability to process thought in the days of combat. Listen to this. People's faces were completely black. No one thought of sleep. The nerves were strained. We're talking about fierce, hand-to-hand, house-to-house fighting on an apocalyptic scale. Soldiers on both sides were pushed so far past the absolute limits of human endurance, it's hard to even comprehend. Finally, Section 5, the cost of victory, the aftermath of the largest tank battle ever fought. When the smoke finally cleared in late August of '43, the landscape was totally devastated, and the strategic reality of the Second World War had permanently shifted. Kursk was just a grueling battle of attrition, and as you can see, the material disparity was completely overwhelming. The Germans rolled in with about 2,400 tanks and assault guns and around 7,400 artillery pieces. But the Soviets, they had nearly double the armor with over 4,800 tanks and an unbelievable 20,000 artillery pieces. Even though the Germans inflicted massive casualties, they just couldn't sustain those losses to their irreplaceable armor and manpower against an opponent with such incredibly deep reserves. The legacy of Kursk is absolutely monumental. Most experts consider it the definitive turning point in the European theater. Why? Well, it marked the final strategic offensive the Germans were ever able to mount on the Eastern Front. From that moment on, the Red Army permanently seized the initiative. It was actually their first successful summer offensive of the whole war. And for the Germans, the cost was devastating. Over 500,000 casualties. Killed, wounded, missing, or captured. It was material and psychological blow from which their war machine literally never recovered. So we started way back with Mongol Tumans sweeping across the steppes and ended up in the muddy, mine-filled fields of Kursk in 1943. The scale of war expanded from tens of thousands to literally millions of men caught in a storm of steel, which leaves us with this one kind of chilling thought for you to ponder today. If Kursk was the absolute climax of industrial warfare, what does the next evolution of annihilation look like? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep questioning the history that shaped our world.